In mid-July 1944, the Soviet First Ukrainian Front, commanded by Marshal Ivan Konev, prepared for a strategic offensive aimed at driving German forces from western Ukraine into eastern Poland. This planning occurred during a pivotal moment. Concurrent to Operation Bagration in the north, the Lviv Sandomierz operation would serve a complementary purpose, drawing German mobile reserves southward and weakening Army Group Center's ability to respond. In the weeks leading up to July, Konev's command massed a formidable force. Strength on 1st July included approximately 2,200 men, nearly 2,050 armored fighting vehicles, and more than 11,000 artillery pieces. For the Soviet leadership, its capture of Lviv and advance to the Vistula River would sever German lines of communication between Ukraine, eastern Poland, and the southern sectors. Recapturing Lviv, taken first by Soviet forces in 1939 and reoccupied since German invasion, had symbolic resonance and would open the path toward Central Europe. Military readiness on both sides reflected this significance. Soviet forces benefited from recent successes and high morale, having been on the offensive for nearly a year. Their force concentration presented a ratio of roughly 2 Soviet soldiers for each German defender. Conversely, German forces, though managing significant rear and flank deployments, lacked comparable depth and were dispersed across multiple fronts. Public sentiment within the Soviet Union was shaped by propaganda that heralded the operation as one of the Stalin's 10 blows, reinforcing the narrative of liberation and forward momentum. Among the local populations, especially in western Ukraine and eastern Poland, expectations varied. Some viewed the Soviets as liberators, others as new occupiers, but verifiable data on civilian reactions remains limited. In terms of intelligence and preparation, the Soviets executed maskirovka, operational deception, to conceal their buildup southward, directly influencing German reserve allocations and reducing reinforcements to Army Group Center. German intelligence, in contrast, underestimated the scale of the Soviet forces and failed to anticipate such a concentrated assault from the south. This miscalculation would prove significant as the offensive commenced. Thus, the conditions on 13th July 1944 were set. A well-prepared Soviet command structure, numerical and materiel superiority, and strategically targeted objectives formed the basis for an operation that would shape the course of the Eastern Front. The stage was now set for the opening of the offensive. The Lviv-Sandomierz offensive opened on 13th July 1944, with coordinated assaults across a broad sector of the front, stretching from the Carpathians in the south to the Bug River in the north. The First Ukrainian Front launched its initial strikes with concentrated artillery barrages lasting up to 2 hours, aimed at neutralizing German forward positions, destroying communication lines, and disrupting command structures. The main Soviet thrusts were delivered by the 3rd Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rybalko and the 1st Guards Tank Army under General Mikhail Katukov, supported by massed infantry formations and aviation from the 2nd Air Army. The initial focus was on breaking through the defensive positions of the German 13th Army Corps and LVI Panzer Corps, which were anchored by fortified localities and minefields. Soviet infantry divisions, moving under artillery cover, advanced in multiple echelons to sustain momentum and exploit any gaps created by tank units were held in readiness behind the front to move through once the infantry had secured breaches in the first defensive belt. In several sectors, assault engineers cleared minefields and obstacles under fire to allow armored formations forward. German defenders, under the overall command of General Oberst Joseph Harp, reacted swiftly to the Soviet assault. Mobile reserves, including elements of the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, were committed to counterattack and delay Soviet breakthroughs. In the early days, these armored counterblows slowed the Soviet advance in certain areas, particularly near Brody, where German tanks engaged in prolonged duels with Soviet armor. However, the disparity in numbers and the overwhelming artillery support available to the Soviets began to tell, forcing German units into gradual withdrawal. The Luftwaffe sought to disrupt Soviet operations through concentrated airstrikes on bridgeheads, supply columns, and armored spearheads. However, Soviet air superiority was evident from the outset. The Second Air Army flew hundreds of sorties daily, targeting German artillery positions, troop concentrations, and transport routes. This aerial dominance limited the ability of German forces to regroup and made it difficult for them to mount sustained counteroffensives. By 15th of July, the Soviet spearheads had advanced between 10 and 15 kilometers in several sectors, capturing forward German positions and forcing a reorganization of the defensive line. Localities such as Horokhiv and Radekiv became scenes of intense fighting, with Soviet units systematically reducing fortified buildings and strongpoints. Civilian populations in these areas were caught in the crossfire, with many displaced as the front passed through. Commanders on both sides began adjusting to the unfolding situation. Soviet High Command recognized that German forces were attempting to orders were issued to accelerate the pace of the offensive in the northern and southern sectors to outflank this concentration. The Germans, aware of the threat of encirclement, sought to hold the Brody sector as long as possible to allow an organized withdrawal from Lviv. The opening phase thus established the operational pattern of the offensive: heavy artillery preparation, rapid exploitation by armored and mechanized units, and relentless pressure on German positions to prevent coherent defensive regrouping. The Soviet command's ability to sustain this tempo would determine the speed and scope of the advance toward the Vistula and the road to Berlin. Strategic planning for the continuation of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive centered on exploiting the initial breaches achieved in mid-July 1944 and converting them into deep penetration. The Soviet First Ukrainian Front's objectives were clear: destroy the bulk of Army Group North Ukraine's forces west of the Bug River, liberate Lviv, and advance to the Vistula River to secure bridgeheads for future operations into central Poland. Stavka directives emphasized speed, coordinated use of mechanized formations, and deep envelopment maneuvers to prevent the Germans from retreating in good order. Marshal Ivan Konev structured his forces for multiple converging thrusts. In the north, the 13th and 60th Armies were to advance toward Lublin and encircle German forces positioned around Brody. In the center, the 38th Army and the 3rd Guards Tank Army aimed directly at Lviv, with orders to bypass heavy resistance where possible and drive rapidly into the city's approaches. In the south, the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 18th Army were to push toward the Carpathian foothills. The German strategic goal was to hold a coherent defensive line long enough to withdraw valuable units to the west, preserving combat strength for the defense of Poland and the approaches to Germany. General Oberst Josef Harp's Army Group North Ukraine relied on fortified positions, mobile counterattacks by panzer divisions, and the difficult terrain of rivers, forests, and urban areas to slow the Soviet advance. The Brody-Lviv sector became the focal point of German defense, with the 13th Army Corps positioned to absorb the main blow. Logistics played a decisive role in the planning phase. The Soviets had concentrated substantial supplies of ammunition, fuel, and rations in forward depots before the offensive, allowing for sustained high-intensity operations. Armored formations. German logistics were under severe strain. Supply lines were under constant attack from Soviet aircraft and partisans, and fuel shortages restricted the mobility of panzer reserves. The loss of rail hubs during the first days of the offensive further complicated German resupply. Doctrinally, the Soviets intended to employ deep battle principles, using successive echelons of troops to maintain unbroken momentum. Initial rifle army assaults would fix and wear down German defenses, after which tank and mechanized corps would exploit breakthroughs, penetrate to operational depth, and encircle major enemy groupings. The Germans adhered to a doctrine of flexible defense, counterattacking into Soviet flanks when possible, then falling back to prepared positions to delay the advance. Propaganda supported military aims on both sides. Soviet publications and radio broadcasts framed the offensive as a liberation of Ukrainian and Polish lands from German occupation, intended to boost morale among troops and civilians alike. Leaflets and loudspeaker messages were directed at enemy soldiers to encourage surrender. German propaganda emphasized the defense of Europe against Soviet expansion, portraying the battle as a struggle to protect German civilians and allies in Poland and Hungary. By 17th July, both commands had adjusted their plans in response to unfolding events. Soviet reconnaissance identified German attempts to form a defensive bulwark around Brody, prompting Stavka to accelerate the envelopment from the north and south. The Germans, recognizing the danger, began pulling units from less threatened sectors to reinforce the Brody pocket. This strategic realignment on both sides set the stage for a decisive clash that would determine the fate of Army Group North Ukraine and open the way to the Vistula. The first major engagements of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive unfolded between 18 and 20 July 1944, when Soviet forces began closing on the German defensive concentrations around Brody and advancing on the approaches to Lviv. The Soviet 13th and 60th Armies attacked from the north, aiming to cut the main supply and withdrawal routes, while the 3rd Guards Tank Army and 38th Army pressed from the east toward the city. In the south, the 1st Guards Tank Army advanced rapidly through less heavily fortified terrain, threatening to envelop German positions from the southwest. The Brody sector quickly became the center of fierce fighting. The German 13th Army Corps, consisting of several infantry divisions and reinforced by elements of the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, had fortified its positions with interconnected trench systems, anti-tank obstacles, and minefields. Soviet artillery preparation was intense, with thousands of shells falling on German positions in a matter of hours. The opening barrages targeted known strongpoints, command posts, and artillery batteries, aiming to disorient the defenders before the infantry assault. Following the bombardment, rifle divisions advanced in dense formations, supported by close armor and self-propelled guns. German defenders responded with well-coordinated counterattacks. Panzer units emerged from concealed positions to strike Soviet spearheads, often forcing them to deploy defensively and slowing the advance. In several sectors, Soviet gains were measured in only hundreds of meters per day, as minefields and determined resistance. However, the pressure on the German flanks began to tell. Soviet mechanized corps operating south of Brody captured several key road junctions, cutting into the lateral movement of German reserves. Further west, the approaches to Lviv were contested by the 38th Army, whose formations engaged in bitter fighting for control of fortified villages and river crossings. The Germans had fortified bridgeheads along the Poltva and Bug rivers, turning natural barriers into defensive lines. Soviet engineers worked under fire to construct pontoon bridges and repair damaged crossings, enabling armored units to push forward in support of the infantry. The combination of artillery barrages, coordinated infantry assaults, and flanking maneuvers gradually forced German units to yield ground. The civilian population in these contested areas faced severe hardships. Villages were evacuated or destroyed. Some civilians were pressed into labor for building fortifications or repairing roads. The rapid changes in control of territory led to food shortages as supply chains for the local population collapsed. By 20th July, the Soviet encirclement of Brody was nearly complete. The northern and southern pincers were within striking distance of closing the gap behind the German 10th Army Corps. Soviet reconnaissance reported that German attempts to withdraw westward were being disrupted by constant airstrikes from the 2nd Air Army, which targeted convoys and bridgeheads. The Luftwaffe, though active, was unable to contest Soviet air superiority effectively, and suffered losses that reduced its capacity to intervene in ground battles. The first phase of heavy engagements confirmed the Soviet ability to sustain pressure along multiple axes while isolating key German formations. The encirclement at Brody, if completed, promised to destroy a significant portion of Army Group North Ukraine's combat strength. For the Germans, the priority became holding open a corridor for retreat while delaying the Soviet advance toward Lviv and the Vistula River. The operational situation was now moving toward a decisive test of maneuver and endurance. Between 21 and 24 July 1944, the battle entered a phase of escalation as the Soviet First Ukrainian Front committed additional forces to seal the encirclement around Brody and push toward Lviv. The northern arm of the pincer, formed by the 13th and 60th Armies, linked up with elements of the 1st Guards Tank Army advancing from the south, effectively cutting off the German 10th Army Corps. Inside the pocket were 8 German divisions, including the 8th and 14th Waffen-SS divisions, the 361st and 349th Infantry divisions, and remnants of panzer and security units. Estimates of the encircled force ranged between 35,000 and 40,000 men. Soviet forces immediately tightened the ring, occupying surrounding villages and dominating the main escape routes with artillery. The 2nd Air Army maintained constant pressure from the air, striking supply dumps, troop concentrations, and attempted breakout formations. German commanders inside the pocket organized defensive perimeters, concentrating armor and artillery at potential breakthrough points. But shortages of fuel and ammunition quickly became critical. The Luftwaffe attempted air supply operations, but Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire disrupted most missions, and the quantities delivered were insufficient for sustained resistance. Meanwhile, Soviet advances outside the pocket gained momentum. The 38th Army moved closer to the eastern out. In the south, the 1st Guards Tank Army penetrated into the open terrain near Sandomierz, threatening to bypass Lviv entirely and advance toward the San River. This maneuver forced German High Command to divert reserves from the north to protect withdrawal routes into Poland, further weakening the defense of the encircled 10th Army Corps. The fighting within the Brody Pocket intensified as Soviet forces launched coordinated assaults from multiple directions. Artillery bombardments were followed by infantry attacks supported by tanks and assault guns, aiming to reduce the pocket in stages. German units conducted desperate counterattacks to regain high ground or reopen roads, but each success was short-lived, as many had fled before the encirclement was completed, but those remaining faced bombardment, destruction of homes, and severe shortages of food and medical care. The collapse of local administration meant that survival depended on whatever could be scavenged or bartered. By 24th July, Soviet forces had compressed the pocket to a few kilometers in diameter. Communications between the trapped divisions and Army Group North Ukraine became sporadic, with messages reporting dwindling supplies and mounting casualties. German command outside the pocket debated whether to commit significant reserves to a relief operation, but the rapid Soviet advance elsewhere and the risk of further encirclements made large-scale rescue efforts impractical. At this stage, the offensive had achieved one of its key operational objectives: the destruction of a substantial portion of German combat strength in western Ukraine. The fall of the Brody Pocket would free Soviet forces to concentrate on capturing Lviv and pushing toward the Vistula River. For the Germans, the loss would mean a severe reduction in available forces to defend the southern approaches to Poland, accelerating the collapse of their Eastern Front positions. From 25 to 28 July 1944, the Soviet First Ukrainian Front concentrated its efforts on completing the destruction of the Brody Pocket, while simultaneously launching full-scale operations to seize Lviv. Inside the encirclement, the German 3rd Army Corps faced continuous Soviet assaults, supported by concentrated artillery fire and close air support. Soviet infantry, advancing in coordinated waves, attacked from multiple directions to divide the pocket into smaller segments, preventing the defenders from massing their remaining combat power. The 3rd Guards Tank Army and 60th Army pressed from the north and east, while the 1st Guards Tank Army and 38th Army closed in from the south and west. German forces within the pocket, numbering between 35,000 and 40,000 at the outset, attempted several breakout operations. On 26 July, a concentrated thrust involving elements of the 14th Waffen-SS Division and remnants of the 361st Infantry Division briefly broke through Soviet forward positions toward the northwest. However, Soviet reserves quickly countered, sealing the gap and inflicting heavy losses. Similar attempts on the following days failed under heavy artillery and aerial bombardment. Shortages of fuel reduced the mobility of German armor, limiting the ability to coordinate breakouts with infantry movements. By 28th of July, organized German resistance within the pocket had largely collapsed. Soviet forces captured thousands of prisoners, including senior officers of the 13th Army Corps, along with significant quantities of abandoned equipment, tanks, artillery pieces, motor vehicles, and ammunition stocks. Estimates indicate that fewer than 5,000 German troops managed to escape in small groups, many without heavy weapons. The loss of the Brody Pocket eliminated a major defensive formation of Army Group North Ukraine and removed a substantial armored reserve from German control in the sector. While the pocket was being reduced, Soviet forces to the west advanced rapidly toward Lviv. The 38th Army engaged in heavy street fighting on the eastern outskirts by 26 July, encountering determined German rearguards that used fortified buildings, barricades, and prepared firing positions. The 1st Guards Tank Army maneuvered to envelop the city from the south, cutting road and rail connections toward the Carpathians and preventing reinforcement from Hungarian units stationed farther west. The 3rd Guards Tank Army pushed north of Lviv to block escape routes toward the San River. Lviv's defense was organized by remnants of several German divisions withdrawn from previous positions, reinforced by police and auxiliary units. Despite the depletion of manpower and equipment, the defenders fought to delay the Soviet entry, using the urban terrain to their advantage. Soviet commanders sought to avoid prolonged house-to-house combat where possible, applying heavy artillery and airstrikes against strongpoints before advancing. On 27 July, coordinated attacks from multiple directions breached the main defensive lines. By evening, Soviet and Czechoslovak units had entered the central districts, capturing key administrative buildings and transportation hubs. Sporadic resistance continued into the next day, but organized German defense ceased as remaining troops withdrew or were captured. The liberation of Lviv was announced on 27 July, marking a significant milestone in the offensive. The dual success of eliminating the Brody Pocket and capturing Lviv within days created a major gap in the German front. Soviet forces now had an open route toward the Vistula River, with the potential to secure bridgeheads deep in enemy-held territory. For the Germans, the loss of both the city and a large portion of their combat forces in the sector meant that defensive operations in southern Poland would have to be conducted under severe manpower and equipment shortages, setting the stage for the next decisive phase of the campaign. Following the capture of Lviv at the end of July 1944, the Soviet First Ukrainian Front moved quickly to adapt its operational plans for the next stage of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive. The destruction of the Brody Pocket and the fall of Lviv had opened a wide operational gap in the German front, and Marshal Konev sought to exploit this by advancing rapidly toward the Vistula River before the enemy could establish new defensive positions. The strategic aim now was to seize and hold bridgeheads on the western bank of the Vistula in the Sandomierz area, creating a forward base for future operations into central Poland and, ultimately, toward Berlin. The main Soviet strike groups for this phase were the 3rd Guards Tank Army, the 1st Guards Tank Army, and the 13th and 60th Armies, supported by the 5th Guards Army and 4th Tank Army. These formations were ordered to advance along converging axes toward the Vistula, with armored and mechanized corps in the lead to maintain momentum. Infantry armies followed to secure flanks, hold captured ground, and eliminate isolated enemy forces bypassed in the rapid advance. The 2nd Air Army provided continuous reconnaissance and close support, targeting German columns attempting to regroup in southern Poland. For the Germans, the priority was to halt the Soviet advance before it reached the Vistula. Army Group North Ukraine, now severely weakened, reorganized its remaining units along successive defensive lines in the Tarnów-Kielce-Sandomierz sector. Reinforcements were brought in from Army Group Center and from reserves stationed in central Poland, including elements of the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions and infantry divisions transferred from quieter fronts. The new defensive strategy relied on using rivers, urban centers, and prepared positions to slow the Soviet advance, buying time for more substantial defenses to be built behind the Vistula. Despite these efforts, the speed of the Soviet advance proved difficult to counter. In the first days of August, the 3rd Guards Tank Army crossed the San River in multiple locations, capturing key crossings before German demolition teams could destroy them. The 1st Guards Tank Army advanced through Yarosław and Przemyśl, bypassing strong points and leaving them to be cleared by following infantry units. German rear guards, often composed of small combined arms detachments, attempted to delay the Soviet armor with anti-tank ambushes and controlled demolitions of bridges, but these measures had only temporary effect. The logistical demands of the rapid pursuit were significant. Soviet supply columns had to operate over increasingly long lines of communication, often along roads damaged by combat or clogged with retreating enemy traffic and displaced civilians. Fuel shortages occasionally slowed armored spearheads, forcing them to pause while supplies caught up. The Red Army's logistical services responded by using captured German fuel stocks and repairing rail lines to shorten delivery routes. German logistics were under even greater strain as the rapid Soviet advance disrupted their railway network and forced them to rely on limited road transport under constant air attack. Partisan activity also played a role in this phase. Soviet-aligned resistance groups in occupied Poland provided intelligence on German troop movements and conducted sabotage operations against railway lines and bridges. These actions further hampered German efforts to establish coherent defensive positions ahead of the Vistula. By mid-August, Soviet spearheads had reached the eastern bank of the Vistula in the Sandomierz area. Forward elements began immediate preparations to cross the river, recognizing that seizing bridgeheads before the Germans could reinforce the stage was set for one of the most critical and challenging operations of the entire offensive, forcing the Vistula and holding ground west of it against determined German counterattacks. This would test both the endurance of Soviet troops after weeks of continuous advance and the ability of German forces to mount effective resistance after repeated defeats. The crossing of the Vistula River in the Sandomierz area began in mid-August 1944 and marked the turning point of the final phase of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive. The Soviet First Ukrainian Front understood that securing a firm bridgehead on the western bank was critical not only for the continuation of operations toward central Poland, but also for establishing a springboard for the eventual advance into Germany. German command, recognizing the same, rushed reinforcements to the sector. The initial crossings were carried out by forward detachments of the 5th Guards Army and the 13th Army. On 1–2 August, reconnaissance and assault units crossed the river using boats, rafts, and improvised means under the cover of artillery and smoke screens. Engineers quickly followed to establish pontoon bridges capable of supporting infantry and light vehicles. By 3rd August, several battalions were firmly established on the western bank near the towns of Baranov, Sandomierz, and Sandomierz itself. These forward positions were immediately subjected to German artillery fire and counterattacks, but Soviet troops repelled them, holding onto narrow strips of territory along the bank. Marshal Konev reinforced the bridgehead rapidly, committing elements of the 3rd Guards Tank Army and 4th Tank Army across newly constructed pontoon. By 5th August, the Soviet bridgehead had widened to more than 20 kilometers and extended 8 to 10 kilometers in depth. The rapid influx of armor gave the Soviets a significant advantage in repelling immediate German assaults. The German response was swift and determined. Army Group North Ukraine, now under pressure along the entire front, committed some of its most capable units to destroy the bridgehead. These included the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, the elite 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart, and the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. Over several days in early August, these formations launched repeated counterattacks, often involving dozens of tanks, supported by infantry and self-propelled guns. The fighting was intense, with Soviet and German armor clashing at close range in fields and villages west of the river. Soviet defensive tactics in the bridgehead relied on depth and flexibility. Anti-tank gun lines were established in layers, supported by artillery firing from the eastern bank. Mobile reserves of tanks and mechanized infantry were held back to strike at German penetrations. The 2nd Air Army provided continuous air cover and ground attack missions, targeting German tank concentrations and supply convoys moving toward the battle area. Despite heavy losses on both sides, the Soviet position held. By mid-August, the bridgehead had expanded further, reaching dimensions of approximately 40 kilometers in width and up to 12–15 kilometers in depth. The Germans had failed to dislodge the Soviets despite committing significant forces and suffering heavy casualties in both personnel and equipment. The fighting consumed German reserves that might otherwise have been used to bolster defenses elsewhere on the Eastern Front. The establishment and defense of the Sandomierz bridgehead marked a decisive shift in the operational balance. For the Soviets, it provided a forward base for future offensives into southern Poland and beyond. For the Germans, it represented the loss of a key defensive line along the Vistula and a foothold for Soviet forces west of the river that could not be eliminated despite repeated efforts. The stage was now set for the next critical decisions that would determine whether this bridgehead could be transformed into the launching point for the final drive toward Berlin. By late August 1944, the Sandomierz bridgehead had become one of the most fiercely contested sectors on the Eastern Front. The Soviet First Ukrainian Front having secured a foothold west of the Vistula, now focused on expanding and reinforcing it to withstand sustained German counteroffensives. Marshal Konev prioritized the rapid construction of fortifications inside. The engineers worked around the clock to improve pontoon bridges and lay additional crossings to facilitate the constant flow of reinforcements, ammunition, and fuel from the eastern bank. German command, unwilling to accept the loss of the West Bank in this sector, launched a major counteroffensive on 11th August aimed at collapsing the bridgehead before it could be further reinforced. The operation was spearheaded by 4 panzer divisions, including the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, supported by heavy tanks from the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, equipped with Tiger IIs. This was one of the first large-scale combat deployments of these heavy tanks on the Eastern Front. German forces sought to split the bridgehead in two, destroy Soviet armor inside, and force the remaining units back across the river. The German assault began with intense artillery and mortar bombardments, followed by armored thrusts toward the villages of Studzianki and Ogeldau, which were key to controlling the road network inside the bridgehead. In the opening engagements, German Tiger IIs demonstrated formidable firepower, knocking out Soviet T-34-85s at long range. However, their limited mobility and mechanical issues soon became apparent. Soviet anti-tank units, using concealed positions and massed fire from 76mm and 85mm guns, scored hits that disabled or destroyed several of the heavy tanks. In one notable encounter near Ogeldau, Soviet tank crews ambushed and destroyed multiple Tiger IIs by exploiting their slow maneuvering in confined terrain. Soviet defense combined static and mobile elements. While rifle divisions held fortified lines against infantry assaults, tank brigades executed counterattacks against German penetrations, aiming to isolate and eliminate attacking spearheads before they could consolidate gains. Artillery from both sides pounded suspected assembly areas and crossroads, turning the countryside into a continuous battlefield. The Second Air Army maintained pressure on German rear areas, targeting fuel dumps and transport columns, further complicating the resupply of the attacking formations. After more than a week of heavy fighting, German forces failed to achieve their objectives. The bridgehead not only held, but also slightly expanded as Soviet counterattacks regained lost ground. German losses included dozens of tanks, among them a significant portion of the Tiger IIs committed, as well as thousands of personnel. Soviet losses were also considerable, particularly in armor and artillery. By the end of August, it was evident that the German capacity for large-scale counteroffensives in the sector was diminishing. The Sandomierz bridgehead had withstood its most serious challenge, and now stood as a permanent Soviet position west of the Vistula. This success meant that any future German defensive planning in Poland would have to account for a Soviet foothold capable of launching deep operations into the heart of the country. The outcome of the fighting in August effectively confirmed the bridgehead's role as a launch point for the eventual advance into Germany's eastern territories, bringing the strategic goal of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive within reach. The conclusion of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive in late August 1944 left the Soviet First Ukrainian Front in possession of both its operational objectives and a strategic position that would influence the remainder of the war on the Eastern Front. With Lviv liberated, the Brody Pocket eliminated, and the Sandomierz bridgehead firmly secured, Soviet forces had opened the southern route toward central Poland and, ultimately, Berlin. The offensive, lasting from 13th July to 29th August, had pushed the front line hundreds of kilometers westward, destroyed significant portions of Army Group North Ukraine, and established a permanent Soviet presence on the western bank of the Vistula. The immediate aftermath for the German side was severe. The destruction of 8 divisions in the Brody Pocket, coupled with heavy losses in the battles for Lviv and the bridgehead, left Army Group North Ukraine with depleted manpower and reduced armored strength. The failure to eliminate the Sandomierz bridgehead, despite committing elite formations and heavy tanks, underscored the declining operational capabilities of the Wehrmacht in the east. The loss of Lviv also severed critical communication and supply links to German forces in the Carpathians and further south, complicating coordination with Army Group South Ukraine, which itself was under heavy pressure. For the Soviet Union, the operation was both a military and political success. Militarily, it demonstrated the Red Army's ability to conduct large-scale, coordinated, multi-phase operations that combined deep encirclements with sustained pursuit and river-crossing operations. The offensive's success ensured that Soviet forces were positioned to launch subsequent operations in southern Poland and Slovakia without the need for prolonged regrouping. Politically, the liberation of western Ukraine and the advance into Polish territory reinforced Soviet influence in the region and contributed to post-war territorial arrangements. The humanitarian consequences were considerable. Combat operations had devastated large areas of western Ukraine, and cities such as Lviv suffered damage from artillery and street fighting, while rural areas along the front endured destruction of homes, infrastructure, and farmland. Civilian casualties, displacement, and shortages of food and medical supplies were widespread. The advancing Soviet forces also initiated political changes in liberated areas, including the re-establishment of Soviet administrative structures and the integration of local resources into the war effort. In terms of strategic impact, the Sandomierz bridgehead emerged as one of the most important Soviet footholds west of the Vistula. Over the following months, it was fortified and stocked with supplies in preparation for the Vistula-Oder offensive, launched in January 1945. Its location allowed Soviet forces to bypass heavily fortified German positions farther north and strike directly into the heart of German defenses. From the German perspective, the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive marked a decisive loss of initiative in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. The inability to hold key terrain or conduct successful large-scale counteroffensives meant that the Wehrmacht in this theater was now forced into a continuous defensive posture, reacting to Soviet advances rather than shaping the battlefield. The depletion of reserves in the attempt to contain the Sandomierz bridgehead also weakened German defenses in other sectors, contributing to the overall deterioration of the Eastern Front by the end of 1944. In historical retrospect, the operation's success lay not only in its territorial gains, but also in the way it set the conditions for the Red Army's final offensives into Central Europe. It was one of the key campaigns of the summer of 1944 that, together with Operation Bagration in the north, the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive opened the road to Berlin, both geographically and operationally, and demonstrated the capacity of the Soviet armed forces to sustain strategic offensives across multiple fronts until the war's end.